So African cities have seen an increase in population growth, forcing governments to face a host of development challenges. Rapid urbanization in major cities on the continent, such as Johannesburg, mean that most of its people live in informal settlements with poor access to services. And that translates to new buildings and infrastructure needing to help cities meet demands. But are they being put up at a rapid pace? That's a story for another day. We take a look at what the future may look like for cities on the African continent, and people that have been imagining what true African cities look like are Dr Sechaba Maape, and senior lecturer at Wits University and the founder of Architecture, as well as Menzi Ndlovu, an architect who also plays in the AI space, rather. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time this afternoon. Perhaps let's start with the exhibition that you recently showcased at Sifunukwazi. Talk to us, Dr. Maape, about Noha Mojozi.
Okay, so the exhibition really was an opportunity for us to explore some of these ideas about what a future African city could be using the latest technology of AI. So, you know, the principle was that I came back from Venice because I was curating the Venice Architecture Biennale South African Pavilion, which was showcasing an idea of the laboratory of the future, which was about Africa as the laboratory of the future. And there were a lot of people there speculating about what could the future of Africa be. And so when I came back home, I thought, you know, we need to take control of this narrative more as South Africans. You know, people in the international arena, in the international sphere, you know, doing this on our behalf. We need to take control of what it could be like to have future African cities. And luckily, we've got this new technology, AI, which is, you know, a technology that has allowed us to visualize future African cities in a way that we could have never done before. You know, it could have taken us another 10 years, 20 years to be able to make the kind of speculative visions of a future African city had it not been for the AI technology. So the whole idea of the exhibition was to showcase what future African cities could be so that people could be inspired towards these visions.
Menzi, when we speak of the future African cities, we note in the exhibition also from the piece that you guys worked on that informal settlements are still there, but they are reimagined. Just introduce that concept to our viewers.
Yeah, I think this one kind of hit home for me, you know, because I also come from a rural background and I had to move into urban areas for better living and better standards. But what I realized is that the standard of living in the urban city doesn't allow us to still practice our way as black Africans based on just the structures and the architecture and the spaces that we live in. You know, so most of the time you find that you have to go back home to practice any rituals that you want to do. So the idea was then to start looking at the existing fabric, especially in formal settlement, because that is the architecture that is actually designed by the people. There's no architecture architect doing any space planning there. So, but what I noticed is that people are actually not taking pride of their own African indigenous knowledge in terms of construction. You know, they come from these huts that are very well designed, using mud, local material, very sustainable, you know, good for the weather, climate, and all of that. And when they come to the urban areas, they almost search for these scraps, you know what I mean? And I call them scraps because it's always recycled material, but it's not actually good to use as construction and actually not very sustainable. You know, you find them what we call shacks nowadays, you know, using obviously corrugated iron, you know, which is very hot during summer and very cold during winter. But then when you look at an African hut, it's actually the opposite. You know, winter it's very warm, it keeps you warm, and then in summer also it lets in cool air that it stores. So I started understanding that people are not taking pride in that, you know, in how they build. You know, it's almost as if we've lost a sense of identity. And the whole vision that we did with Sechaba was to how do we then bring pride back You know, not to say that now that you come in the rural area, don't be embarrassed by that. You know, come here, still use the same principles, take pride in who you are, and build yourself a nice little hut if you have to do that, using local material, already using scrap material, but then maybe we can be smart in how we do it by understanding where we come from. So in the spaces that I actually envision using AI, like Sechaba mentioned, that's the tool we're using now, I try to look at informal settlement, these shacks that are actually based on principles that we actually where we come from as Africans. And that was the whole idea around it.
But people want that new. They want that architecture that, you know, you can get it in Italy or you can get it in New York or whatever. And so when you speak of losing that sense of identity, you play quite well with Reimagine. For instance, there's a lamp that we've been showing our viewers. Talk to us about what that concept is about and what material is used from the days of old.
So the lamp also was another concept that when I studied, obviously, most of us, when we start getting money, we know we're having a better living in the urban context. We move into nice big houses in Bryanston, for instance. But if you look at these houses, there's actually spiritual practices when you look at just the indigenous architecture where we come from. So for instance, the lamp then is like, okay, you can't build a hut in Bryanston. But then what if, and then I got this idea, what if I take actually the roof of a hut, a typical roof of a hut, which is made out of thatch material, and actually create this lamp that is woven with the same material. So actually it feels like it's you underneath the hut, you know, in your room. And the whole idea is to modernize our own ways of how we used to do things in the urban context, you know, so that we can have pride again, like how we're saying, we wanna move forward, you know, but how do you modernize that architecture and bring it forward? And that's where creativity and architecture felt like there's a long way to go in catching up. Art has done it a lot. So the lamp is sort of like a reminder, and the material used is actually taking back into local indigenous materials that we use back in the rural areas and bring them in the urban context and say, look, you can do this.
Dr. Maape, a lot of what he speaks about also is what is kind of like lifelong work you've been doing since being in the space, right? Taking a look at using indigenous knowledge, but also speaking about spaces that we can use for rituals or the way. And so there is in the exhibition what you called Ngakaya Setsu, but it takes on the form of a robot. So things like that, what does that mean? Maybe you can introduce that to our viewers.
Yeah, so I think the whole point really, like what Menzi is saying, is to try and show that the principles of our culture don't necessarily have to lose their value just because we are talking about a modern context. You know, the idea of an AI robot, for instance, that is a traditional healer. You only think, I mean, when we think about AI robots, we think about Terminator and how they're going to take over the world and kill everyone and those sort of things. But we need to rescript what we're talking about in terms of the future. We need to decolonize the future. We need to think about, you know, for example, when people think about a futuristic African city, they think about flying cars, they think about Dubai-like style buildings, you know, and that's not necessarily what futuristic has to be. You know, if you look at some of the images that I created, some of them are very dignified public spaces full of black people, for example. How many really dignified, well-resourced public spaces do we have in South Africa? And what will it take for us to create those kind of public spaces, for example? You know, I always say that in places like Amsterdam or in Denmark or wherever, those public spaces are well-resourced because the country has a lot of money. And you feel like, oh, you know, it's so free, you can play with your children. And so here at home, to actually imagine that, to really imagine a place full of black people, dignified, really well-resourced, beautiful architecture, out in the public space, playing with your children, that's actually a futuristic thought, you know, and we don't really think like that. We are so, you know, addicted to a certain kind of paradigm or a certain kind of idea of futurism that we need to really decolonize the idea of what the future is for us as Africans.
What does that mean? And I ask in a sense, when you speak of what will it take to create dignified public spaces, for instance, if you go to a township, you drive down the road, it's a tiny road. The plumbing or sewage is really not that great. People are living literally on top of each other, where this is even too much space. You can hear what's going on in my yard. I can hear what's going on in your yard. That creates a certain kind of psychology as well, where you now know everything about me, right? And what does that also do if you take a trip down to Durban? Now the neighbors know who they are, plus they're not there or whatever. So there's so many things that are also tied to the kind of spaces that people are put into. So when you speak about decolonizing it, what will it take to create those dignified public spaces, but also taking a look at the mentality of it and realizing to create dignified public spaces where people are burning in a building in Johannesburg, where you can't even go to the city of Johannesburg because it's so full. You're thinking a place like India, when you see it on TikTok or you see it on Instagram, or actually, we've got places like that in South Africa.
Yeah, 100%.
I think that's the whole point. You see, so when planners and architects think about what is the best model for our cities, they tend to look at Copenhagen and Denmark and those sort of things. And for example, like I said, the idea of a public space. And they use theories or philosophies like freedom. You know, a public space needs to be a space where you feel free. So they're obviously, because they've got a broader social and economic system that facilitates a space which is free, they can actually afford to use philosophies and notions like freedom. But in a context like ours, if you go to a park somewhere in Johannesburg, for example, and you say this space is free, you're going to get people who are smoking yelpe, you're going to get people who are doing drug dealing, you can't even take your kids there. So the philosophies that we're importing are already by themselves not coherent with our situation. So hence, for example, in some of the images I produced, you see a lot of people, a lot of community in these public spaces. So what if, for instance, instead of thinking about technological infrastructure as the solution to deal with how you resolve public spaces, and you come up with social infrastructure? What if it's about building deeper social networks? And we can see some of those things happening in some parts of our societies, like Stokvels, and communities rising up and finding innovations to deal with some of the issues that are rising of a result of some of the failures in our society. So we need to think in a much more innovative way about what are we actually saying when we say we want to resolve the issues of the city, instead of just trying to copy-paste the things that are happening overseas and using random theories and philosophies that don't really work for our context. Just a quick example like public transport. We've got this example of someone who copied the rapid bus systems from overseas and brought them here. But you need safety to have really good public transport. Otherwise, you have to resource it highly. Like, for example, the Gautrain. Gautrain, you have to resource it. You can't even chew gum. It's almost like a little mini Europe in order for that facility to exist and work. So the point is we need to be inventive, have our own indigenous solutions that are catered for our context.
Menzi, you spoke a little bit earlier on about your background and where you come from the rural space, and you come into Johannesburg, and that mind shift that happens. So in trying to find the answer of what it will take to create dignified public spaces, what role do you and I have in maintaining those public spaces? Because today you're going to have a beautiful African city, and then, like you say, you'll find, people who are selling drugs, you'll find your boys. The technical director of the show today was mentioning that in their neighborhood, there's none of that, where you'll find that a house is broken into and no one on the street knows what gemang or what happened, right? So they have created a network where we're going to keep the space clean, we're going to keep the space maintained, we're going to keep the space safe, even though we're in the township, but we're taking responsibility of the way that we are living. So you can present us with these beautiful dingaka tsa roboto, and then you find that ngaka haisana tsebe, there, or it's no longer got a voice anymore. There's no batteries because they're now being used for something else. And so I guess maybe what role do we have to play in maintaining, creating, and protecting the spaces that we occupy?
Yeah, I think the biggest part that we struggle with right now, especially what I felt personally, was that when you come to the urban context and urban areas coming from a rural area, is that you almost reject your background. And when you reject your background, you reject who you are. And therefore, most of us living here have no pride in the spaces that we live in. We almost feel like we're guests in this space. And you know, if you're a guest in a space, you're not going to take pride in it. You're not going to take care of it. You're not even going to care. You know, you're going to litter wherever you go. You're going to still, it's almost as if I'm here to do what I have to do and I'm going back home. So the whole idea about actually bringing rural in the urban context is so people can actually be familiar with who they are and take pride in those spaces. And that's the whole idea and the agenda that we're trying to push by having these new African cities, to say that bring the rural area here, modernize it like how we want to move forward. And then maybe people, when they see that, oh, this reminds me of who I am as a black person, I want to protect this. And therefore, you create this tight community of people taking pride in architecture, these spaces that we've envisioned. And then all of a sudden people are like, let's create a system, like how you're saying, a social system where we take care of our own spaces, and actually people start by generation over generation understanding that actually here there could be a home too, moving forward. So it's all a psychological in a sense of us finding identity again in who we are. You know, and if everyone can just remember who they are, take pride in being black, walk into any space and be bold about who you are, even if, you know, we come from all backgrounds, you know. And I think if we're unapologetic in that, and especially with the architecture that we're doing, we're trying to be unapologetic with the Indigenous African architecture. And I think people also play a huge role because they, at the end of the day, are the architects of the space. We can design a space, but it's the people that actually bring it alive. It's the people that add the spirit to the space. It's the people that actually bring it life. Otherwise, it's just an object that us architects have looked at.
That's true. Very quickly, Dr. Maape, how is that being received, right? The vision, like we said a little bit earlier on, somebody will say,
well, you see, the part of the thing that we're doing with our exhibition, the way we've set the exhibition up, is that we're trying to help reframe people's meaning frameworks. Because people actually are kind of brainwashed, so to speak, because of social media, because of movies and those sort of things. They are actually inadvertently sold a certain kind of vision of what aspiration is. And hence I'm saying to you that we need to decolonize things like, you know, our idea of a future city, an aspirational city, a successful city. What does that actually look like? And what could it look like if it is according to who we are and what our values are? Because, you know, to assume that Dubai is the standard, what makes you think that Dubai is the standard? Have you been to Dubai? Do you speak to people from Dubai? You know, what is it? Is it just because the building is shiny? You know, will you feel at home in Dubai? Are you going to be able to braai and be with your relatives and enjoy the kind of things that we enjoy? So, you see, the exhibition, the purpose of the exhibition is to help reframe South Africans. You know, my last point, when the cities in South Africa were created, they were someone else's vision of a utopia. At the time, it was a white utopia for white people only. And we were kept away from these cities. So we actually never participated in the creation of our cities as African people. So I'm saying that we need to see that we have the agency to create the cities the way we want them to be, and stop trying to mimic other people and do things the way it's going to actually serve us as Africans.
Gentlemen, even if I don't see it in my lifetime, it's got to be realized in some lifetime. Thank you very much for your time. And also, I'm putting in an order for that lamp. Dr. Sechaba Maape, Senior Lecturer at Wits and founder of Afritecture, and Menzi, Ndlovu, an architect at Wits University. Thank you once again.